So what I thought I'd do to try to continue working with that smaller group of farmers that are doing an adaptation planning, or doing an adaptation plan now, is that the first 45 minutes of this session is very much about adaptation options. And what I want to do, what I've planned to do, is just share a lot of stories. I've been collecting adaptation stories from farmers, diversified farmers all across the US for about 12 years now, or so, maybe 14. And so I just want to share some examples of how those farmers, being diversified and many of them certified organic, all of them farming organically and many of them certified, how they are thinking about managing heavy rains, too much water, not enough water, warmer winters, warmer summer nights, those kinds of issues, new kinds of pests and disease, and heavier pest and disease pressures. So I just want to tell some of those stories. So we'll do that for about the first 45 minutes. And then I want to invite you to maybe go ahead and dip into another presentation if you're not in the workshop, although you're welcome to stay if you'd like. What we'll be doing for the rest of the workshop is the Farmers in the Planning workshop will get working on the third step of their plan. But anyone else could also get started thinking about adaptation strategies that might work for their farm. And I'd be happy to get y'all, once I get the workshop farmers going, I'd be happy to work with you individually. Okay, does that make sense? So we'll give this a try. Let Oak folks know whether or not, how well it worked. Maybe I should put it that way. It's not whether or not, but how well that worked. Sound good? Okay, the last thing before I get going, I just want to say for those of you who have not been in a session with me at this conference, just a little bit about who I am and why you might want to listen to what I have to say. And the first thing I'll let you know is that I have for 30 years where I'm trained as a soil scientist. I was doing soil health way before it was cool, and have always been very committed to recognizing that soil health is the basis for community health. And I know you're organic farmers, you've probably all heard that chain: soil health, plant health, livestock health, and so on. So food health and community health. And I have basically lived that my whole professional career. I've worked as a USDA research scientist. I've worked in Congress. I have farmed. I farmed diversified vegetables, both in Virginia, the coastal plain of Virginia, and also in Asheville, North Carolina, which is where I now am based. I've been an activist for sustainable and organic farming for many, many years. And what else have I done? I don't know, a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff in there. And you can learn more about me at some point if you're interested. You go to my website, cultivatingresilience.com, and there's a whole bunch of stuff there. About a decade ago or so, 15 years ago, I had a really striking experience. I was market gardening and in Asheville, and we had this incredible period of rain, unprecedented rain. And I was farming with two partners who we had really worked hard to create this luscious bunch of double-duck beds, about 3,000 square feet of all double-duck beds, very beautiful, great soil. And we went out to the farm one day, and after this wet period, and there were springs coming up in all the beds. And ultimately, they drowned all the crops that we had grown. And that really got my attention. And I started to look at what's going on with climate change. Remember, this was like more than a decade ago. Things are really different now. But back then, climate change was being talked about as something in the future sometime that we might have to start thinking about and adapting to. At any rate, long story short, I ended up being invited to join a group, a scientist for USDA, to put together the USDA's very first report on adapting to climate change. And because nobody else wanted to do it, I led the adaptation chapter, and that started me on the path that I stayed on to this day, which is understanding how we can use resilient science in farm management in order to maintain the success of farming in this changing weather that we're experiencing. So lots more little tidbits in there and around, but that gives you a sense of sort of who I am and who you're listening to here this morning. I'm sorry, this afternoon. Okay, so I'd like to get going. We're going to have a blazing tour of some of the 50 farmers that I stayed in touch with for the last 12 years or so, decade or so. And my intention here is to tell stories. They're going to be brief, but you're able to get to all the stories and you can read the whole story. So what I want to encourage you to do is, if there's a certain farmer that really resonates with you, their type of farming system, or just you think they are just incredibly smart and you want to go read a little bit more about what they're doing, just know, even though we're going to rapidly move through these farms today, you can go back and actually read a full interview with them. And many of them, of the stories I'll share today, you actually can read over the last decade or so what they've experienced, how weather's changed, what they've tried, what's worked. Okay, so let's get going. So I like to frame this kind of a session in perhaps you can hear my voice. I am not 100% this afternoon. Maybe I should just admit that right now. But at any rate, I like to frame talking about agricultural adaptation in this very simple set of statements, which the National Farmers Union put out a couple of years ago. And the reason is because I think it's such a complex topic: climate change, weather patterns changing, how farmers adapt. All of that is can be so complex. But these three statements just lay it out pretty simply, and I think in a pretty useful way. And maybe practical way as well. And it's that what does climate change mean for farmers? It's going to get more difficult and expensive to grow food. In fact, I think it's already more difficult and expensive to grow food. And that's not gonna, we're not shifting into some new normal that we just have to get used to. The weather patterns are going to continue to change over time. So it's not that we just are going to chunk into some new set of weather patterns. What farmers need to get, I think, in order to be successful in the coming years, is to recognize that the weather patterns are a moving target. And really what you need to get good at is just pivoting, being nimble to any kind of change that comes along. So it's going to get more difficult and expensive to grow food. Climate stresses will strain relationships between farmers and communities. We're already seeing this writ large in the western part of the US around water issues. It's not so common in the East, but all the data that we have suggests it's coming. It's coming to the east. We have a lot of water here, but we're also getting these more intense rainfalls, and that water is running off. We're not saving it. And so there are going to be water issues coming to the east. And then the last one, which is a little ray of hope, I think, and I think we're already seeing this coming to life as well, is that agricultural landscapes can be a source of climate change solutions. And so what I'm seeing happening is that, for example, with the climate smart projects that are starting up all over the country, and Oak has one as well, and some other kinds of projects that are recognizing the community benefits of providing incentives for farmers to change how they're managing their landscapes, designing and managing their landscapes. So this is all, it's kind of in the future, but it's all happening now. And so it's something that a resilient farmer is going to keep in mind as you are designing and managing your farm. So before we get going on the stories, I just want to, let's just remember together what risk is, because really that's what we're talking about. Agricultural risk is getting more complex and more difficult to manage because of changing weather patterns. And climate change is also, it's changing weather patterns locally, but it's also disturbing supply chains, it's disturbing marketing, it's disturbing every part, it touches every part of what a farm needs to be successful. And the way that it's changing both probabilities, so the chance that something's gonna happen, and also the consequences, the damages as a result of that particular weather event. Climate risk is changing by just moving everything from that lower left to the upper right. And so that's part of why it's going to get more expensive and difficult to grow food. And so because this new kind of risk that farmers want to begin to think about how they're going to manage, we're really having to move from a more traditional risk management framework or model, which is on the left-hand side there. Pretty nice, neat. Each little part of the farming system is its own separate little silo, and you manage each of them separately. Production, financial, marketing, all that, human. These are all different types of risk that farmers manage. We need to move from that to a different kind of model that is actually more realistic and more what's actually going on a farm, which is that you do have all those little risks, but they're sitting kind of internal to the farm. And the farm is sitting inside of a family. And when I speak about family this way, I'm really speaking broadly about the group of people who love that farm, who take care of it, who want it to succeed and go on in the future. So it's a loose definition of family. And then that family and that farm is nested within a community. And so what's wrong with this, or what's limiting about this older idea of agricultural risk, if you notice, there's no connection between, for example, production and financial or marketing. Is that actually true? Isn't what you produce somehow related to your marketing? There's connections in there. So they're all kind of missing connections. There's all sorts of relationships that if you are willing to move to this new way of thinking about managing risk, this nested farm within community, in family within community, you can take advantage of the relationships. They're already there anyway. You're probably already managing some of them anyway. And it turns out that resilience resides in the community, in the relationships in that model, the community family farm model. That's great. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, great, Laura, how the heck do I do that? Well, we have a very well-established approach to farm management called whole farm management. Oh. Sorry about that, folks. It's been around a long time, 50 years, something like that. We don't use it too much because we just don't. And It's basically a way of planning and managing a farm that's kind of you can think of it, business calls this a continuous improvement cycle. But you're basically, the steps are setting goals, assessing your resources, you have goals, what kind of resources do you have to achieve those goals, make a plan and act, and then monitor performance. So you make a plan, you monitor performance, and then, so you ask that question, how well did my plan work? And then you make changes to your plan if you need to. Very well understood, traditional, sort of the alternative, traditional approach to farm management. And we know there's a lot of good evidence that this actually cultivates the resilience of the farm if you take this kind of approach. So today, the process that I'm teaching in this workshop and the resources that we're using in the workshop are basically these three resources: the SARE, Cultivating Climate Resilience on Farms and Ranches. There are some on the tables, the tables near the front, those SARE bulletins if you'd like to take one. There's also more, the SARE table outside. They have plenty of these as well. So please take one if you'd like to take it. And then adaptation resources for agriculture. And it's these two bulletins, the USDA bulletin, adaptation resources, the SARE bulletin, cultivating climate resilience, that have gone into creating this 5 steps to your climate resilience plan, which is a guide that you can find online, and it's the guide that the farmers in the workshop are using to move through a planning process. I just want to talk a little bit more about that adaptation resources for agriculture. It's a free PDF download online. And what I want you to notice is that guide has set up a whole menu according to these 8 different strategies. So you can think of these as adaptation strategies. And each one of them is accompanied by, is describing a whole set of practices. So that's an important idea to get a good handle on in this session. A strategy is a broad approach to reducing climate risk. A practice is a specific action that you're going to take. Strategies describe a whole lot of different actions. Strategies are generally applicable to a farm, but the specific practice is going to depend so much on your farm system, your resources, your location, and so on, the details of your farm. I don't think I want to say more than that right now about this. What the 5 steps guide does is it includes all of these adaptation strategies in it. So we basically took everything from the SARE bulletin plus this USDA bulletin and summarized it in the guide. Okay, and then the other thing, just to, well, it's new for some of you, but we've seen it in the workshop already. This is from the SARE guide, and it's basically laying out the overall map. You can think of it as a road map to adaptation planning. And if you notice on the top left-hand side, we've got climate risk there. Talked just a little bit about climate risk already. And it turns out if you dig a little deeper into climate risk, there's these 3 things that are related to climate risk. And you can read about it in the bulletin. It's not so important for what we're trying to do today in this session. But the 3 things are just the kind of weather that you're experiencing on your farm, that's exposure, how sensitive the individual crops and livestock and buildings and people are to that particular weather event. And then adaptive capacity is, for me, where it gets interesting, because adaptive capacity is about how the relationships on the farm and the relationships between farm and community can help to reduce the damage caused by disturbances and shocks. Okay? And adaptive capacity is also really interesting because it connects directly to resilience. So remember, we're moving from a risk management kind of a thinking to a resilience thinking. And in order to do that, we want to think about response, recovery, and transformation. So it turns out these are 3 complementary capacities of resilience. And pretty much most of us, when we think about resilience, what do we think about? That bounce back. That bounce back. Well, that's the recovery part of resilience. But as I started digging into resilience and started to think about how we might be able to use resilience science in agriculture and in management, what I quickly learned was it's actually those other 2 capacities, response and transformation, that have a lot of value to agriculture. And actually, honestly, to any other kind of work, planning work being done around adapting to climate change. Why? Because it's great to be able to bounce back when there's damage, but how about if we design and manage a system so that when there's a disturbance, there is no damage? What do you think about that? Then you never need to bounce back. There's kind of a poster child of what's called response. So that's managing, design and management for the response of the farm system so that when there's a disturbance, there's no damage. And there's one particular type of practice or goal on a farmer's goal, that is, for right now, the poster child of this idea of response. Can anybody tell me what that is? Have you heard the story about how healthy soils can help with both the too much water and the not enough water of climate change, changing weather patterns? Yeah. And in fact, healthy soils can help you reduce or avoid the damage from a heavy rainfall or a drought. Do you see how that works? Are y'all putting this together now? You know, a healthy soil will hold more water between rains, so there's less damage during a drought. And a healthy soil will also can withstand the damage done by heavy rains as well. So that's response. How can we design and manage our farms to increase the response capacity so we never have to recover? We need recovery capacity, that bounce back, because given the nature of changing weather patterns and the uncertainties, there's likely going to be damage at some point. So you do want to have some ability to bounce back pretty quickly. But when you're thinking, using resilience thinking in your farm management, what you're thinking there is, how can I design and manage my farm so that I can recover swiftly and at low cost when there is damage? And then this last piece, this transformation, very simply, that's just the capacity to look ahead and prepare for what you know is coming. You begin making changes in your design and management of your farm so that that farm can be resilient to future change. I like to think of that as the bounce forward. The bounce forward. We're actually thinking about how we get ready for what's coming ahead. And it turns out that resilient farmers use all 3 all the time. They're always thinking about cultivating all 3 capacities on their farm. And then the last bit of this is the climate resilience toolbox, the bottom part of this diagram. And what that is really helping, inviting you to remember, is that on any particular farm, all the practices within a certain strategy are not likely going to work. They just aren't going to fit your situation or your farm. And so one thing you can do as you begin to get into thinking about cultivating resilience on your farm is begin collecting, creating a toolbox, and adding the specific tools that you think are going to help. And when I say specific tools, I mean specific practices. So you're going to think about strategies that work for your farm, and then you want to go into those different practices within a strategy and figure out which ones fit your farm. The other thing that the toolbox invites you to remember is that you always want to think about all the resources under your management. We all tend, it's very human, we have kind of go-to reactions to a problem on the farm or a challenge, or if you're trying to reduce risk. But because of the nature of climate risk, we do want to take a moment as we're planning, doing a adaptation plan, to think through all of the different resources. And to remember that yes, natural resources are being threatened by changing weather patterns, but so are people. So are people. And their physical resources, your buildings, your tools. And so think about, this part of this figure invites you just to remember that you have a broad set of resources that you can use to design and manage a more resilient farm. And then last thing I want to say, notice that whole farm planning shows up as the very first bullet there. So all of this thinking about specific practices and thinking through this broad range of resources that you have, all of that is occurring within this whole farm planning approach. So you're keeping that in mind. Sorry, forgot about those. Okay, and then the last thing, just to let you know, I've already mentioned it, but I've been following a group of farmers all over the country. They're all diversified farmers. About a third are certified organic. These days, they started out calling themselves sustainable mostly. And these days, they might use terms like regenerative or organic or climate smart. So, you know, we're in this really rich place in agriculture right now that we're coming up with more specific words to try to describe what it is our goals are in agriculture. But they're all basically diversified farmers. And I was really interested, after I got done with the USDA report, I was really interested to kind of ground truth some of the resilient science that I learned and that I included in that USDA report. And so I started conversations with farmers around the country. And I've kept up with them. That really wasn't my intent at the time, but it's really amazing and such a gift that they continue to talk with me. And so I've reported on those conversations. I'm telling the farm stories in resilient agriculture. But also you can go online. It's called Real World Resilience, and I've collected all the farmer stories online. And many of them are free PDF download. You can download the whole story if you'd like. So what have these farmers taught me? Over this decade or so that I've been working with them, checking in with them, seeing how things are going. Here are the key resilient strategies, and these are resilient strategies, remember strategies, not actions, of some of America's best diversified farmers. And I can say that with confidence because all of these farmers that I've worked with, I had several filters as I was developing this group of farmers. And one of them was that they had to be recognized either regionally or nationally as a very good farmer. So I was really interested to learn how very good diversified farmers were adapting to climate change. So the strategies, and these are very strong themes across this whole group of farmers. And many of these strategies also, in research done since I started, these are also true for many other kinds of farmers. Soil health, really important. How you achieve soil health depends on the specifics of your farm. Plant biodiversity. So these farmers have always valued biodiversity on their farms, but they're even leaning into it even more now to help with, to reduce climate risk. They tend to go for diverse, high-value markets. So they're using that diversity, marketing diversity, to reduce risk that any one market might go away suddenly. But within each market channel, they're making an effort to choose the highest value type of market within that channel. Improved water management is big all over the country. Both water management to deal with not enough water, water management to deal with too much water. Physical protection, also growing more and more important. Growing under some kind of structure, using some kind of a tunnel, a caterpillar tunnel or something, or row covers, some kind of physical protection, and also using tarps, not for any soil health benefit, but simply so that soil is prepared for planting whenever it's at the right moisture, and then covered and uncovered, covered to protect it from rain, and then uncovered to plant as you need it. And then recovery reserves. All of these farmers put focus on making sure if there is some sort of a shock or disturbance to the system, that they have something to draw on to recover. The other thing about these strategies, and I think this fits with the idea of response, recovery, and transformation, is that resilient farmers use all of these strategies. They're not focused on just one. They're trying to use all of them. So I want to give you a few, so that you've got the key practices or the key strategies. And then this group of farmers helped me think about what are the qualities of resilient farmers, like personal qualities. What will really help? And the first is that you know how to produce profitable crops. That's kind of a big first check you need to be able to make. You know how to identify resources and use them effectively. You're willing to try to do different kinds of things, different ways of doing things. You reframe problems and threats into lessons and opportunities. What's that called? I think that's called a growth mindset now. You have good communication skills. And you care for both your land. You sort of look inward to your land and outward to community. The rest of this list, you're willing to ask for help, and you're willing to help others. You know how to cope with loss and change. You feel connected to others and a higher power, whatever that means for you. And you tend to have a hopeful, positive outlook. Now, when I look at this list, first of all, I think it's pretty demanding. It's pretty demanding, and it's all about you. It's all about, your own personal qualities, right? But when I look at that, I have 30 years of working in sustainable and organic farming. That is this community. That is this community, more or less. And so I think that's an enormous resource that organic farmers, in your case, can draw on to build resilience. And in fact, we're doing it in this conference. You're learning from others, you're teaching others. Okay. So I want to step into, just to remind everyone, we are doing a workshop as kind of part of this session. And we're using this 5 steps to your Regenerative Climate Resilience Plan, this workbook, which it's a free download. And what the group of farmers in the planning session today will be doing is beginning to start identifying effective resilience strategies for their farm. But what I'd like to do for the next 10 or 15 minutes, I think, is to go back to this idea of response, recovery, and transformation, and tell you some stories about how diversified farmers around the country have put this into practice. Okay. Any questions before I get into the storytelling? Okay. And Shannon, we're going to go a little long. Okay, so first of all, some examples of farmers, how farmers, diversified farmers, cultivate response capacity. And remember, this is that ability to design and manage an agricultural operation to avoid or reduce damage from disturbances and shocks. And another thing, we got to go a tad deeper into this idea of response capacity, because it turns out there are 2 major different kinds of response capacity. And the first one is called targeted response, different kinds of strategies. First is targeted response, and really what you're doing there, a way to know whether or not you're targeting your thinking is you're asking the question, resilience of what to what? It's very specific. You have a specific threat to your farm, and you're trying to come up with a specific action that's going to reduce that threat. And so some examples of targeted response strategies would be irrigation, which is that's dealing with a specific threat of drought. You see how this is working? Integrated pest management, particularly when you've got a specific pest and you are working to reduce the risk from that pest. And then another adaptation I'm hearing so much about these days is resistant cultivars, mostly heat resistant, mostly diversified veg producers, and mostly heat. So resistant cultivars is another example of a targeted response. And then there's general response strategies, and I like to think of this as enhancing ecosystem processes, or you could think of it as ecosystem health or the farm health. And examples of this would be soil health, crop diversification, and livestock integration. And why it's important, or why it's useful anyway, to recognize whether or not you're thinking about a targeted strategy or a general response strategy is because typically targeted response strategies don't do a whole lot more for you except for address that threat. And sometimes you need to address that, and that's great, and you want to use a targeted response. But the general response strategies often do a whole lot more for you than just address 1 or 2 threats. You know, soil health is doing all kinds of great things for you on your farm. So that's a reason, one reason to have a little bit of an idea anyway, that there are these different kinds of response strategies. The other reason is because it turns out that resilient farmers use both, but they emphasize general response strategies. Okay? So you do want to think about that a little bit. Okay, here come the farm stories. We're done with all the lessons. Here's the farm stories. So this is, and you're going to, these are all from around the country, partly because that's what I've got to share with you, but partly because I think there's so much for us to learn from farmers in other places, because they're dealing with, in some cases, threats that are on the way here, you're going to have to be thinking about in the future. And in another way, they're also dealing with all the same threats, all the same weather patterns that are causing you challenges. And so we are all living right now in this session, this idea of learning from others, right? So we're just learning from these farmers all around the country. And so this is Full Belly Farm in California, a little bit north of San Francisco. They're a 400-acre diversified organic farm. They have a diverse set of products, and they also manage a very diverse landscape, perennial orchards, which are grazed, so there's silvopasture. They have annual crops, pastures, a lot of hedgerows, and they've put hedgerows in for wind as windscreens. But they've chosen plants that they also harvest and sell. So they're fruiting plants, fruits and nuts. And then they've also, because flooding has become such a difficult situation for them to manage, they decided to go ahead and restore their riparian areas as a way to reduce the flood risk on the farm. And some of that also involved taking production land that was in floodplains out of production and do restoration. They have direct and wholesale markets. They have a 1,500 member CSA. And some of the changes that they've made are more efficient irrigation because they need a lot more irrigation. Drought-resistant cover crops. They've really worked on dialing in their crop rotations to need less water. And one way they can do that, they really need the water for the vegetables, for high-quality vegetables, but they don't need the water for cover crops necessarily. And so they've really started to look at drought-resistant cover crops and shifting out more water-needing cover crops to ones that are more drought-resistant. I've talked about the managed riparian area. They've got a lengthening season out there, but it's variable. It's spring and fall is just much more variable. And so they added growing under cover, that season extension, so that they can take advantage of the longer growing season, but are protected from the variability of the season. And then the other thing they spend a lot of effort and time on is what I call labor care here. But they have they're very involved with their employees. They do profit sharing. They do training. They're really working on supporting their labor force. And that's really paid off over time because they have a very stable labor force and they're also very well trained. Any questions? Thoughts? That's kind of what I want to do with the next. We're going to move through these fairly quickly. Does that work for you? Is that okay? And again, you can go to realworldresilience.com and read the whole Full Belly story. So you can read all the details. So this is Jim Crawford. He has New Morning Farm in Pennsylvania. It's kind of mid-southern Pennsylvania. And he's got 95 acres total, but it's about 45 acres of diversified veg production. He's got some high tunnels and some greenhouses. His soil health program is primarily cover crops, compost, and he uses both sprinkler and drip irrigation. He sells to farmers markets in the region and also has a wholesale cooperative. The cooperative is based at his farm and involves farms in the region. And so he has the challenges that climate change has brought to New Morning is primarily in just incredible flooding rains, hurricanes in the fall, much more hurricanes than they ever used to have to deal with. So you can think of it. And also higher pest pressures, both traditional pests and also new pests. And so they have really dialed in this idea of prepping soil for, in his case, in the fall when it's drier for spring planting, because as many of you, if you're growing vegetables, you know how important succession is. And so they were really having trouble staying on time with their successions. So they now prep soil in the fall, lay out plastic using equipment they have for making beds and laying plastic out for crops. And then they just take up the plastic in the spring as they're planting their successions. The other thing that Jem is really thankful for, although he's troubled by their use, because of the higher pest pressures and new pests, he's really thankful that there's this whole suite of organic certified pesticides now. It's not something he typically did in the past. He tended to try to use biodiversity and all those other ways of managing the ecosystem to keep pest levels low. But he said with the change in the pressure and also the new pest, he's really glad he has that in his toolbox now, and they are using those as well to stay successful. And then the other resilience benefit or resilience strategy that he uses, although they've been doing this a long time, but he recognized that in more variable weather, it's really helpful, is this marketing co-op, because now you can look to farms across a region to supply accounts, wholesale accounts. And so if one farm or two farms has some kind of disturbance or gets some damage, you can draw from other farms in the region. If you have a question about something, just put your hand up or sing out, okay? And is this helpful? Okay, great. Okay, so you can find this table in the 5 Steps Guide, and I'm not going to go through it. I just want you to know that what we've done with the guide is summarized the strategies. And again, we took the USDA Adaptation Guide and then the SARE Guide, and we put it all together and tried to create a table so you could kind of take a look about and figure out what makes sense, so that as you're trying to build your own climate resilience toolbox, you can move through here and get some ideas about where you might want to, what you might want to try. And so this is targeted response strategies, and those first 2 farm stories are examples of more targeted. All the stories, remember, one thing I've learned working with these farmers is that resilient farmers use all 3 strategies: response, recovery, transformation. So you're going to see elements of all of those strategies on these farms. But what I tried to do was choose farms that highlighted these different approaches to cultivating resilience. Okay, who hasn't heard of Will Harris these days? No? Okay, excellent. No, that's good. So Will Harris has a pretty big operation, 2,500 acres. He's certified organic. He's multi-species. He's doing multi-species grazing to the nth degree, 8 different species. And he also grows some organic vegetables. He does some agritourism on his farm. And he's also doing on-farm processing. He mostly sells wholesale, but he also has some direct sales on the farm. And so Will is a great example of these more general resilience strategies. So he's just really dialed in the livestock diversity. He has worked hard on soil health and creating diverse pastures that he's moving all these animals through all the time. And then the other piece is this on-farm processing. So he actually invested in USDA certified processing facilities for all the livestock that he grows. So those are 3 examples. And the other example being this, because he's doing his own processing, and he's certified organic, he's growing really, he's selling very high value products as well. His latest, it's not on this slide, but his latest ideas. He's doing a ton of, what is it called? Agrivoltaic grazing. He's made a deal with the power company in his area, and he's grazing under there. They're putting solar panels under the rights-of-ways of the high-tension electric power lines, and they've hired him, or they're paying him to graze, to keep the, to take care of the vegetation and manage the vegetation under those lines. So Will Harris, if you haven't heard of him, go check him out. He's always got something cooking. He's always doing something else. Okay, Rebecca and Tom at Fair Share Farm, they're in Missouri. They're a 10-acre diversified veg. They grow some fruits. They do some culinary herbs. They have sheep and laying hens actually now, and they do vegetable ferments as well as a value-added product. They are really into reducing emissions on their farm and producing the energy that they need. So you can see they've done quite a number of, they've got a lot of infrastructure changes that they've made. And so they produce, they sell produce and eggs marketed through a CSA. They sell ferments online and at farmers markets and to retailers. So that's their basic marketing. They have been experienced much more heat, particularly in the summertime, more drought, and also heavier rains. And so some of the changes that they've made are to mulch more heavily their fields. They've worked on reducing tillage, mostly just so there's no bare soil or less bare soil at any time of the year. They're doing some of what I've already described, bed prep and tarp, using heat-resistant cultivars. They're planting later. The spring is more variable in their area, and their decision was to retreat from early spring. So they're waiting to plant later in the season. But the thing I really want to show you is that they're using what's called masterline earthworks on their farm, and that's to deal with the heavy rains. They're getting these incredible rainstorms, and we're having a hard time dealing with that. So let me just show you. Here's a picture of their whole farm. That's the whole 10 acres there that you're seeing. And this is what the farm used to look like. And after heavy rain, it would be weeks before they could get back in to work in these fields. And so they heard about this thing called masterlining. It's Mark Shepard's approach to managing surface water on landscapes. I don't want to go into the details. You can learn more about it. But I did want to just show you what happened when they masterlined this farm. And so now you can see it was all pretty straight. You see all of that, pretty typical straight fields, and now everything is on contour, basically. And Mark Shepard's approach is basically you create berms and swales, and you move the water away from the wet areas in the farm and towards the dry areas, so you're spreading out and sinking water in. They have put perennials on the berms, so they're essentially doing alley cropping now. It's between the rows of perennial trees, fruit trees and shrubs, and nut trees and shrubs. They're producing annual vegetables, just like they used to. And then the bottom picture, that just shows, I can't remember exactly, it was a very intense rainfall on the left-hand side. And then that's the same field 12 hours later, just to show how much water this new way of arranging their field was able to move out of the production area. And so again, just these are more general response strategies that I've just described, and we've collected them in the 5 Steps Guide in the same way and organized them according to the different kinds of assets farmers have to use. So this is general response capacity. Okay, recovery capacity. So this is that bounce back. Just want to give you a few examples of what that looks like. So this is Setbush Hollow Farm. It's the Hayes family. They have 160 acres of upland pastures. They grow sheep, pasture layers, broilers, beef, and pork. So very diversified, pasture-based farm. Their story was really about a specific, very damaging event. It was in 2011. Two very powerful hurricanes hit the farm within 1 week of each other. It was like boom, boom. And you can go read their story at Real World Resilience, but Jim said that experience really reset their thinking in a lot of ways, and they decided they really had to get much better at preparing for damaging events. One of the things you can read in that story, as Jim said, it was breathtaking to look out his window over the road, and in 15 minutes there was no road anymore. They couldn't leave the farm. It was the very end of the season. They had almost all of their harvesting had been done. They had all that meat in the freezer. They lost power, and they had no way to move it or take it anywhere else. So a lot in that, but basically it reset their thinking. And so you can see that last bullet, they really thought about infrastructure. They added drainage, more water catchment. They reinforced all their field shelters, which were blown to bits during those storms. They added additional feed storage, additional pasture. They leased pasture in a more protected area nearby so that they could go move their animals if there was another hurricane coming. And then they added a bunch of solar backup power. And then Jim Cohn, he's a sort of organic orchard and farm. He uses a type of a Swedish sandwich system in his orchard. If you're any real fruit growers in here? A little bit, yeah, never heard of that. Yeah, go to the story, read about it. But he's basically doing a silvopasture kind of a system, although he doesn't call it silvopasture. He markets fresh apples, pumpkins, apple-finished pork. That sounds good, and also makes hard cider. And the point of his story when we're thinking about recovery capacity, and he speaks to it so well in his story, he said he decided as weather became more variable, he decided he wanted a shelf-stable product, that he needed to have something that would keep cash flow going, no matter what the conditions were in any particular year. And so one thing that's true about apples, I understand, is that there can be boom and bust years. And so you can have really big yields and then followed by not quite so much yields. And so what he started doing is making cider in the boom years and putting it on the shelf. And in a bad year, he could continue that cash flow going by selling the cider. And then in the 5 Steps Guide, you can look at these collected recovery strategies. And then finally, transformation capacity. Sorry, I didn't say what that was. So here you're thinking about making big adjustments to your farm system, changing the relationships between the people, the crops, the livestock, and the land in order to enhance the overall resilience. So again, looking forward, really thinking about preparing for the future. I think the difference between, one way you can think about the difference between response and transformation capacity is response capacity, those actions tend to be relatively, they make a change on the farm relatively quickly, and transformation actions take a little more time. Take a little more time to put into place. And so just 3 more examples. This is Gary and Linda Price. They're ranchers in Texas. Their approach to resilience was to restore. They bought up their ranch in bits and bobs over time. Most of it very degraded grazing land. They accumulated the 2,000 acres, and then they decided they were going to restore it to native tallgrass prairies. Took a long time. They used planned grazing to do it. They have a 190 cow herd. And the real test of the resilience of their approach was that in 2012, I don't know if anyone else here remembers that, but there was an incredible drought, really in the Mid-South. And ranchers everywhere in the Mid-South and Southwest had to destock. They couldn't feed their animals, and they couldn't buy in feed because it was such a broad area and such a devastating drought. And Gary and Linda did not have to destock. Their ranch was able to feed their livestock through that entire period. So really a strong test and testament to the resilience of something like pasture-based livestock grazing native prairie. Tom Trantham has Happy Cow Creamery in South Carolina. And an interesting thing about this story is that Tom actually put a bunch of changes in place, not because of any weather-related problems, but because of just the problems in the dairy industry. And he just couldn't stay in, but he didn't see that he could stay in business by feeding cows, kind of having a typical conventional dairy. And so what he did is invented this thing called the 12 Aprils. It's an incredibly diverse approach to grazing cover crops. And he called it 12 Aprils because his idea is that he wanted his cows to experience April every month of the year. Every month of the year. And so you can go and learn more about this, but basically this graph here on the lower right-hand side, it's a series of different cover crops. He no-tills the cover crops into a standing Bermuda grass pasture, so there's never any bare soil. It's all no-tilled in. And then he just plants about you see the months of the year across here, across the bottom, and he's basically about every 6 weeks planting a new cover crop that he's going to graze them on 2 months later. See how he's doing that? He also did some other kind of crazy things that really worked for him. Once he stopped feeding concentrate, he didn't need his silos anymore, and so he turned them into a milk bottling plant, basically. So he bottles all his milk right there. He sells at a farm store and also sells in the region, wholesale in the region. Let's see, pasture cropping I've talked about. And he started rotational grazing as well. So that's Tom Trantham. I think we have one more here. Yeah. Y'all heard of this guy? Mark Shepard? So again, transformation stories. So he farms in Wisconsin, but he's nationally known for transforming a rundown corn soybean farm into a completely diverse agroforestry system, and so you're seeing the pictures here from his farm. He has 105 acres. He's certified organic. He's doing diversified annual and perennial crops and livestock. He's also doing some value-added products. He used as his design frame the native oak savanna ecosystem of his area. And his primary woody crops are hazelnuts, chestnuts, walnuts, apples, and elderberries. And his primary annual crops are fresh market vegetables. Again, this is all certified organic. And so those vegetables and then his livestock, he's alley cropping them. So between the rows of trees and shrubs, he's running the livestock and doing the fresh market vegetables. Livestock, very diverse as well: cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, and turkeys. And he's selling both to wholesale and retail markets. So this is probably the most striking of the transformation stories. I do have one more, though. And say what? Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have it on there. It's New Forest Farm. It's in Viola, I think they say it Viola, Wisconsin. Yeah. Mark Shepard didn't put his name on. Apologies for that. And so this is one kind of transformation. But the other kind of transformation, and I wanted to include this also because I'm hearing more and more stories of this nature, which is basically, this is Gail Fuller and Lynette Miller, and they farm in Kansas, and their story, really, their transformation story is they retreated from a floodplain. It's a 5-generation farm. Flooding was happening more and more, and so they sold that farm and they moved to higher ground and established a new farm. And there's a lot of family angst and just that sense of leaving a place that your family's been on for 5 generations. So there's a lot in that story that you can go online and read their story. But Gail in particular, his story is he's actually done 2 major transformations. And the first one was he had been farming 3,500 acres, no-till corn, soy, totally conventional farmer in Kansas. And he shifted to 2,000 acres and diversified his cash crops and added pasture-based beef. That was his first transition. The shift down to 2,000 acres was going back to just the family farm, no rental ground. But the family farm was in a floodplain. And as flooding got worse and worse, they realized they just couldn't continue farming there. And so a lot of conversation, lots of years to make this happen. But eventually they sold the family farm and bought 160 acres, much smaller. They downsized quite a bit, but it's higher in the flood. It's out of the floodplain, and they're now doing fresh produce and food grains and pastured beef and lamb and poultry. So some of the other practices that they're using, they've diversified over those 2 transitions. Gail and Lynette continue to diversify, increase diversity. They also do a thing called dynamic rotation, which I'm also hearing more. If you're growing agronomic crops, this is going to be the most relevant to you. But where you actually have a rotation, and you have in every phase of the rotation, you have options of crops that you put in based on the current weather. It's called dynamic rotation. So you're not just laying it out there, you're thinking about the weather. And remember I said farmers need to be nimble? This is a great example of how, what that looks like, being nimble. And so now you're growing a rotation, but every time you plant a new crop in the rotation, you're taking a look at the current conditions and the projected future conditions for the next few months. And you're selecting a crop within a group of crops in that phase. Yeah, I know. This was a experiment. Yeah, let's see. Gail is also one of the early innovators in cover crop cocktails. So these are these incredibly diverse mixes of cover crops, not 2 or 4, but 15 or 20 different species. The idea with cover crop cocktails is that you're putting enough diversity out in the seed that no matter the weather, something's going to grow, but also wherever that seed drops is going to have specific characteristics. It might be a little bit wetter, it might be a little bit drier, maybe the soil is a little more clayey or sandy. And so creating these diverse mix of seeds and broadcasting them, you have a better shot at, no matter where a seed lands, there's a chance that you'll get good cover crop growth. So that's cover crop cocktails, if you haven't heard about that. It's kind of a big deal more in the Midwest and more in agronomic operations. Oh, let's see. Yep, I think I've covered all the rest of those. And so then, just to remind you, in this 5 Steps guide, we collected all the strategies there and organized them according to assets. And I think I just want to finish with 2 other thoughts. And so the first is that the farmers I've been working with have taught me that you want to consider transformation. So these are these bigger changes to your farm. And so when this is happening to you, this is when you want to think about maybe doing some greater change on your farm. And the first is if the current operation is consistently falling short of meeting goals, if the cost of maintaining the current system is growing unacceptably high. So your farm is not meeting your goals, or it's just getting more and more expensive to maintain it. And then the last is that when it becomes clear that change is inevitable because of growing challenges of one kind or another. So this is a nice little checklist as you're thinking about maybe transition is where I need to go, right? But also remember that resilient farmers are cultivating response, recovery, and transformation all at the same time, too. And then some assets. Another question I asked them is, okay, particularly these folks, and there are others in the group of farmers that did these really involved transformations. What helped you do that? I asked them, what kind of person, what is it about you that helped you successfully do that? And here's a few of the characteristics that they shared with me. And the first is you really do need to be able to think about your farm as a system. You need to think about it as all the bits and then all the relationships between the parts, the land and the livestock and the people and the crops, right? You need good creative thinking and good problem-solving skills. And this really draws back, this leans a lot on experience, just experience farming. Need some practical management experience as well, and a willingness to consider alternatives. Are you noticing that some of these are scanning really well with kind of the 10 qualities of resilient farmers, right? It's really helpful, and many of the farmers I've been speaking to mention this, really helpful if your technical assistance providers actually know a little something about resilience. That's tough. That's tough right now. Many of the farmers that I've worked with and some of the stories I've shared today, these folks are innovating so far ahead of the Extension Service. But that's not to say forget the Extension Service. What I think is let's fund the Extension Service and let's help them, get on top of this so that they're actually able to help farmers with adaptation. That's a whole nother conversation, but yeah. willingness to make mistakes, that's that growth mindset, and learn from them. And then I just love this, having courage, just having courage to courage and conviction, and then persistence. Like, don't give up if it doesn't work the first year or so. Okay, so as I said, this was an experiment, and ideally my workshop farmers would have had about a half hour to begin working on choosing strategies for their farms. But we're rapidly running out of time, so it's very lucky that we added an extra meeting, a Zoom meeting, next week. So workshop farmers, we'll get there. We'll get there with y'all and get you going on step 3. We've got a few more minutes. I wonder if there's any questions or comments or anything you'd like to ask me. What do you? Oh, yeah. The Zoom meeting is just for the folks that signed up for the workshop, the Climate Resilience Planning Workshop. Oh.
And we had ordered some of these 5 steps packets for those who were participating in the workshop. So if you, we have more probably available than folks from the workshop here. So if you participated, if you signed up for the workshop, you definitely should get one. And then we have extras, but probably not enough for the whole room. So if you're interested in this packet, I'll leave it here with Laura.
Okay.
Okay. As someone doing research and extension on this subject, is it too late to sign up for the workshop?
I think that would depend on what Oak would like to do, but I don't think it's too late, particularly if you have some planning skills already.
I know some Oak people.
Do you know some? You can get your people to talk to their people?
Yeah, I know some of them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this packet that Sarah? Yeah, the packet that Sarah, I kind of couldn't figure out who you were there. This is the 5 steps guide. And so we would like the farmers that signed up for the workshop to get them first, but you can also download it free. And let's do that. So we just get to the resources. So you can go to Regenerative Farm Resilience Guide and download the packet, the 5 steps guide. That's a new website that we've just released, and it is designed to be a DIY resilience planning website for farmers. So there's the guide, but there's a lot of other resources as well. I do want to warn you that particular guide, the funding we got for that was, they asked us to focus on the Hudson Valley of New York, diversified growers in the Hudson Valley of New York. But what I can say is now that we've done that work, that there wasn't a whole lot of regionally appropriate resources. So a lot of the resources are national, and any farmer could benefit from them. Any other thoughts, questions? Does anybody know a farmer I really ought to be adding to my is there somebody in this part of the world that is just really rocking it on these kinds of changes? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know her well, yeah. Yeah.